A 90-minute geopolitical analysis. When a superpower removes a head of state by force, it is not chaos. It is not impulse. It is not even primarily about the individual being removed. It is architecture. It is calculation. It is the visible expression of incentives that have been building for months, sometimes years, within systems of power that most people never see and fewer still understand. On January the 3rd, 2026, at approximately 2 in the morning local time, the United States military conducted what President Trump later described as one of the most stunning displays of American military might in the nation's history. More than 150 aircraft launched from 20 bases across the Western Hemisphere. Delta Force operators, supported by CIA intelligence on the ground, extracted Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife from their fortified residence in Caracas. By dawn, Maduro was aboard the USS Iwo Jima. By afternoon, he was in a Manhattan federal courthouse, facing narco-terrorism charges that had been prepared years earlier. The world responded with predictable outrage and equally predictable celebration. Allies of Venezuela condemned the operation as a violation of international law and sovereignty. Allies of the United States praised it as a blow against dictatorship and narco-terrorism. The United Nations called emergency sessions. International law experts debated precedent and legality. Protesters took to streets in Caracas and Havana. Venezuelans in Miami draped themselves in flags and danced. All of this is noise. Not irrelevant noise, but noise nonetheless. The moral arguments, the legal debates, the emotional responses, these are the surface. Beneath the surface lies something more fundamental and more uncomfortable to examine. Structural logic. Strategic calculation. The cold mathematics of power operating according to its own incentives. This operation was not about bringing democracy to Venezuela, though that may be a stated goal. It was not primarily about stopping drug trafficking, though that provides legal justification. It was not even primarily about Nicolás Maduro as an individual, though he served as the focal point. This operation was about reasserting American dominance over energy systems, sending unmistakable messages to rival powers and exploiting a window of opportunity that may not remain open indefinitely. Understanding why this invasion happened requires setting aside moral judgments, at least temporarily. It requires examining incentive structures, strategic calculations, and the brutal logic of how power operates when it perceives threats to its position. The question is not whether the invasion was right or wrong. The question is, why did it make strategic sense to American decision makers at this particular moment? What do they gain in the short and medium term? What risks do they accept? And what does this reveal about how global power actually functions beneath the rhetoric of international law and democratic values? What follows is an analysis of Operation Absolute Resolve, the strategic logic behind the Venezuela invasion, and what it reveals about American power in the current global order. This is not news reporting. This is not breaking analysis of developing events. This is structural examination of why superpowers behave the way they do when their interests are threatened. We will move slowly through the layers of this operation, examining short-term benefits, medium-term strategic positioning, long-term risks, and the hidden architecture that makes such operations possible. This analysis will be uncomfortable. It will not provide simple answers or clear moral positions. It will examine power as it operates, not as we might wish it to operate. And it will reveal patterns that extend far beyond Venezuela, far beyond this particular operation, into the fundamental dynamics of how hegemonic powers maintain their position in a competitive international system. Before we proceed into this analysis, I want to ask something of you. If this kind of deep geopolitical examination interests you, if you value analysis that goes beneath the surface of mainstream narratives, subscribe to this channel. We need your support to continue producing this level of content. And in the comments below, tell me, what is your view on this invasion? Not your emotional reaction, but your strategic assessment. What do you think this operation achieves? What risks does it create? Your perspectives matter, and I read every comment. I am Francis, and you are watching Silent Economy. Here, we examine the architecture of power, the structure of global systems, and the logic behind decisions that shape our world. We do not traffic in conspiracy theories or apocalyptic prediction. We analyse incentives, track patterns, and attempt to understand why states behave the way they do. Let us begin. Strategic logic. Why Venezuela? Why now? Venezuela sits atop the world's largest proven oil reserves, larger than Saudi Arabia, larger than Russia. An estimated 300 billion barrels of crude oil lie beneath Venezuelan territory. This is not a minor detail. This is not background information. This is the foundation upon which everything else rests. For years, these reserves have been effectively offline. Venezuelan production collapsed under Maduro's mismanagement and American sanctions. The country that should be producing 3 million barrels per day has been struggling to produce less than a quarter of that. This production collapse served American interests during the period when the United States was focused on developing its own domestic production through fracking. But the global energy landscape has shifted. China has been positioning itself as Venezuela's primary economic partner. Over the past decade, China has provided tens of billions in loans and investments to Venezuela, secured through oil-for-loan arrangements. China has been building infrastructure, establishing deep commercial ties, and positioning itself to benefit when Venezuelan production eventually recovers. From a Chinese perspective, Venezuela represents a long-term strategic energy asset in the Western Hemisphere, reducing China's dependence on Middle Eastern supplies that flow through shipping lanes the US Navy controls. Russia, too, has cultivated close ties with Venezuela, providing military equipment, technical expertise, and diplomatic support. Russia has used Venezuela as a demonstration of its ability to project influence into the American sphere of influence. As a minor but symbolically important counterweight to American power. From an American strategic perspective, this situation had become increasingly intolerable. The largest oil reserves in the world, in the Western Hemisphere, being developed by America's two primary strategic competitors. Every barrel of Venezuelan oil that flows to China is a barrel that strengthens Chinese energy security. Every Russian military advisor in Caracas is a reminder that American hegemony in its own hemisphere is not absolute. But why now? Why January 2026? several factors converged to create what strategists call a window of opportunity. First, the Trump administration, freshly inaugurated for its second term, had explicitly campaigned on reasserting American strength and reversing what it portrayed as a period of American weakness and retreat. This created domestic political pressure to demonstrate strength through action. Second, the Venezuelan opposition had spent months building legitimacy, particularly after the disputed election of July 2024. Maria Corina Machado and the opposition movement had created a narrative framework that could theoretically justify intervention as supporting democracy. While the Trump administration would ultimately sideline Machado in favor of working with elements of the existing Venezuelan government, her movement provided initial political cover. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the United States had spent months building up military force in the Caribbean. The naval deployment that preceded the operation was the largest American military concentration in the region in decades. This build-up served multiple purposes. It positioned assets for the actual operation. It applied pressure on the Venezuelan government, and it sent messages to any potential defenders of Venezuela that resistance would be futile. The operation itself followed a pattern established in Panama in 1990. The legal justification was similar: narco-terrorism charges. An indictment already on file, characterization of the operation as law enforcement with military support rather than as war or regime change. The timing was even symbolically resonant, occurring 36 years to the day after the Panama operation that captured Manuel Noriega. But the Panama comparison, while useful, obscures important differences. Panama was small, with a population of less than 3 million at the time. Venezuela has 30 million people. Panama's military was weak and quickly surrendered. Venezuela has larger, more professional armed forces and significant paramilitary capabilities. Panama was geographically tiny, a narrow isthmus that could be controlled with limited forces. Venezuela is a large, complex country with difficult terrain. The strategic logic of the Venezuela operation was not to occupy the entire country or to engage in prolonged military operations. It was to decapitate the leadership, demonstrate overwhelming force, and create conditions for a transition that serves American interests. Whether this logic proves correct depends on developments that are still unfolding. But the operation itself reveals what American strategists believed was both possible and necessary at this particular moment. Short-term benefits, the immediate gains. Let us examine with cold clarity what the United States gains immediately from this operation. These are not hypothetical benefits or long-term possibilities. These are advantages that accrue from the moment Maduro was placed in handcuffs. First, and most obviously, the United States now controls access to Venezuelan oil. President Trump stated explicitly that America would run Venezuela and tap its oil reserves to sell to other nations. Whether or not the United States literally governs Venezuela, it now has decisive influence over Venezuelan energy policy. This means several concrete things. It means that Venezuelan oil production, as it recovers, can be directed toward markets and purchasers that serve American interests. It means that contracts signed with China and Russia can be renegotiated or abandoned. It means that Venezuelan oil can be sold in dollars, reinforcing dollar dominance in energy markets. The impact on oil markets is immediate, even before production increases. The very fact that the largest oil reserves in the world are now under American influence affects price expectations, futures contracts, and strategic calculations by other oil producers. Saudi Arabia and other OPEC members must now factor in the potential return of Venezuelan supply under American direction. This gives the United States leverage in ongoing negotiations over production quotas and pricing. Second, the operation sends an unmistakable message to other governments in the Western Hemisphere. The message is, American dominance in this region is not a historical artifact, but an active reality enforced through military power when necessary. Countries that have been drifting toward closer relationships with China or Russia must now recalculate their strategic position. The United States has demonstrated both capability and willingness to use force to maintain its sphere of influence. This message extends beyond Latin America. Oil-producing nations worldwide that have been considering de-dollarization, alternative currency arrangements, or closer ties with America's rivals now have a stark example of what can happen when American strategic interests are sufficiently threatened. Whether or not they believe such action would be directed at them, the very fact that it occurred changes their risk calculation. Third, domestic political benefits within the United States are substantial. The Trump administration can claim a major foreign policy achievement. A dictator removed, drugs interdicted, American strength demonstrated. These are powerful narratives for domestic consumption, particularly for a political movement that has emphasized strength and American dominance. The operation allows Trump to contrast his approach with what he characterizes as weakness or indecisiveness by previous administration. The legal complexities and international law questions that trouble scholars and diplomats matter much less to domestic audiences. Most Americans are not deeply concerned with whether the operation violated international law. They respond to the narrative of American strength and decisive action against a government associated with authoritarianism and drug trafficking. Fourth, the operation disrupts Chinese and Russian plans immediately and concretely. Chinese investments in Venezuela are now under threat. Infrastructure projects face uncertain futures. Oil supply arrangements become unreliable. Russia's military cooperation with Venezuela becomes politically untenable. The billions that China has lent to Venezuela may never be fully repaid, or repayment may occur on terms favorable to the United States rather than China. This disruption serves multiple purposes. It demonstrates that American power can still overwhelm attempts by rivals to establish positions in the Western Hemisphere. It imposes costs on Chinese and Russian strategies, forcing them to recalculate investments and relationships elsewhere. And it creates uncertainty that makes other countries more cautious about aligning too closely with America's competitors. Fifth, market psychology shifts in America's favor. The demonstration of overwhelming military capability and political will to use it affects how markets, investors, and governments perceive American power. This is not merely symbolic. Perceptions of power affect real decisions about currency holdings, investment allocations, and political alignments. When the United States acts decisively and successfully, it reinforces narratives about American dominance that shape countless small decisions across the global economy. Sixth, the operation establishes precedent and normalizes certain actions. The idea that the United States can conduct military operations to arrest foreign heads of state on criminal charges, while controversial, is no longer unprecedented. Future operations of this type become slightly easier to justify, slightly more normalized. The international system adjusts to a new reality in which such actions are possible. These short-term benefits are substantial and concrete. They accrue immediately, regardless of what happens next in Venezuela. Even if the Venezuelan situation deteriorates, even if American involvement becomes complicated or costly, these immediate gains have already been realized. Understanding American decision-making requires recognizing that states often prioritize short-term benefits even when long-term consequences are uncertain or potentially negative. Medium-term strategic positioning, reinforcing hegemony. Beyond immediate gains lie medium-term strategic advantages that may prove even more significant. These are advantages that unfold over months and years rather than days and weeks, but they build on foundations established by the operation itself. The most important medium-term benefit is reassertion of dollar dominance in global energy markets. The dollar's position as the world's reserve currency rests significantly on its role in oil trading. The petrodollar system, whereby oil is primarily priced and sold in dollars, creates persistent global demand for American currency. This demand allows the United States to run persistent trade deficits, to borrow at lower interest rates, and to exert monetary influence globally. Recent years have seen increasing challenges to dollar dominance in energy markets. China has been establishing yuan-denominated oil trading arrangements. Russia has been pushing for non-dollar energy trade. Saudi Arabia has signaled openness to accepting payment in currencies other than dollars. These developments, while still marginal compared to overall dollar dominance, represent a trend that threatens long-term American economic power. By bringing Venezuelan oil production under American influence, the United States reinforces the petrodollar system. As Venezuelan production recovers, those barrels will be sold in dollars to American allies and partners. This counters the gradual erosion of dollar dominance in energy markets. It demonstrates that the United States can still enforce the dollar's role through power projection when necessary. The operation also significantly disrupts China's long-term energy strategy. China has been working for decades to diversify its energy supplies and reduce dependence on routes that pass through areas of American naval dominance. Venezuela represented one element of this strategy. A source of oil in the Western Hemisphere that could theoretically be transported without transiting American-controlled choke points. With Venezuela now under American influence, China loses this strategic option. Chinese energy security remains heavily dependent on Middle Eastern supplies that must pass through the Strait of Hormuz and the Strait of Malacca, waters where American naval power is overwhelming. This dependence gives the United States leverage over China that extends far beyond energy policy into broader strategic competition. Medium-term credibility effects are also substantial. American allies and partners worldwide watch how the United States responds to challenges to its interests. When the United States allows challenges to accumulate without response, allies begin to question whether American security guarantees are reliable. When the United States acts forcefully and successfully, it demonstrates commitment to defending its interests. This credibility extends to multiple domains. European allies questioning American commitment to NATO observe that the United States is willing to use force to defend its interests. Asian partners concerned about American resolve vis-à-vis China see that America still possesses both military capability and political will to act. Middle Eastern governments navigating between American and Chinese influence note that American power remains formidable. The operation also establishes a deterrent effect regarding de-dollarization. Countries considering moving away from dollar-based trade and reserves must now factor in the possibility of American intervention. While most countries would not face the same level of threat that Venezuela did, the example exists. The risk premium associated with challenging dollar dominance has increased. Infrastructure control represents another medium-term advantage. As American companies and contractors rebuild Venezuelan oil infrastructure, they establish relationships, technical dependencies, and institutional connections that persist for decades. The physical infrastructure itself, the pipelines and refineries and ports, gets designed and built according to standards that integrate with American systems rather than Chinese or Russian ones. This infrastructure lock-in effect is subtle but powerful. Once oil facilities are built to certain specifications, integrated with certain supply chains, maintained by technicians trained in certain ways, changing these systems becomes prohibitively expensive. Even if political relationships shift in the future, the infrastructure creates path dependence that favors continued American involvement. The operation also provides the United States with a testing ground for new forms of intervention and control. How does one manage a country like Venezuela without formal occupation? How does one maintain influence while claiming not to be engaging in nation building? What legal frameworks enable such arrangements? What combinations of military presence, economic leverage, and diplomatic pressure prove most effective? Venezuela becomes a laboratory for American power projection in the 21st century. Finally, the medium-term impact on global governance norms should not be underestimated. The operation pushes boundaries of what is considered acceptable behavior by powerful states. It challenges existing international law frameworks. It creates new precedents. While many countries will condemn these developments, the fact remains that the United States has acted and succeeded. Over time, success reshapes norms. What was once unthinkable becomes merely controversial, and what was controversial becomes gradually normalized. These medium-term benefits build upon each other. Dollar dominance supports American fiscal flexibility. Credibility reinforces alliance structures. Infrastructure control creates long-term dependencies. The testing of new intervention models increases American capability for future operations. Together, these advantages significantly strengthen American strategic position in its competition with China and its management of global economic system. The hidden architecture, how systems coordinate. The Venezuela operation did not emerge from vacuum. It was enabled by architecture that had been built over years. Systems that coordinated without explicit conspiracy, power that operated through institutions rather than individuals. Understanding this architecture reveals how American hegemony actually functions at the structural level. Begin with sanction. The United States has been imposing sanctions on Venezuela since at least 2015, intensifying dramatically under both the Obama and first Trump administration. These sanctions were not merely punitive. They were preparatory. They degraded Venezuelan economic capacity. They created pressure on the Venezuelan government. They established legal frameworks that would later justify military action. They isolated Venezuela from international financial system, making it dependent on relationships with China and Russia that would become politically untenable after American intervention. Sanctions are often discussed as if they are standalone policies, alternatives to military action. This misunderstands their role. Sanctions are siege warfare adapted to the modern financial system. They weaken target governments, create internal instability, and prepare conditions for other actions. The Venezuela sanctions served all these functions, softening the target for eventual military operation. Financial infrastructure coordinated with sanctions. The ability to exclude Venezuela from SSWIFT, to freeze assets, to make it impossible for the Venezuelan government to conduct normal international transactions. All of this relied on the United States' structural power within the global financial system. Banks worldwide complied with American sanctions, not because they were forced at gunpoint, but because non-compliance would cost them access to American markets and dollar clearing systems. The architecture of financial power made economic warfare against Venezuela automatic and comprehensive. Intelligence capabilities were equally crucial. The CIA and other intelligence agencies had been operating in and around Venezuela for years, cultivating sources, mapping networks, understanding vulnerabilities. When the moment came to conduct an operation, this intelligence infrastructure enabled precise action. The fact that Delta Force knew exactly where Maduro was, what his security arrangements looked like, and how to extract him without extended firefight reflects years of intelligence preparation. Military positioning was gradual and deliberate. The naval build-up that preceded the operation was not improvised. Ships were redeployed from other theatres. Aircraft were positioned at bases across the Caribbean and Central America. Special operations forces trained for the specific mission. This military preparation took months and involved thousands of personnel, yet remained largely invisible to public attention until the operation itself occurred. Diplomatic preparation was also essential, though less visible. The United States secured basing rights in Trinidad and Tobago. It coordinated with Colombia regarding airspace and potential contingencies. It managed relationships with Brazilian and other Latin American governments to prevent coordinated opposition. While many countries condemned the operation afterward, none intervened to prevent it. This diplomatic groundwork ensured that the operation would not face meaningful international interference. Legal frameworks had been established years in advance. The indictments against Maduro were filed in 2020, giving the operation a law enforcement justification. The characterization of Venezuelan government officials as narco-terrorists had been developed over years. The precedent of the Panama operation provided historical template. All of this legal infrastructure existed before the decision to act, making the operation appear legally justified within American domestic law while remaining controversial under international law. Media coordination shaped narratives before, during, and after the operation. The emphasis on Maduro's authoritarianism, the coverage of Venezuelan opposition movements, the framing of the operation as liberation rather than invasion, all of this reflected narratives that had been cultivated over years. When the operation occurred, mainstream American media largely presented it within frameworks favorable to American interests, even when questioning specific aspects. Energy companies and contractors were positioned to move quickly. Before the operation, major American oil service companies had relationships with Venezuelan dissidents and technical knowledge of Venezuelan facilities. After the operation, they could rapidly deploy personnel and equipment to begin restoration work. This readiness was not accidental, but reflected planning and preparation by private sector actors aligned with American strategic interests. This architecture reveals something important about how hegemonic power operates in the modern world. It is not a single actor making decisions in isolation. It is a system of institutions, each with its own logic, and capabilities that coordinate without requiring central direction. Sanctions authorities do not need to be told explicitly that their work prepares for military action. Intelligence agencies understand their role in enabling operations. Financial institutions know that compliance with sanctions serves broader strategic goals. Energy companies recognize opportunities when government actions create them. This systemic coordination makes American power extraordinarily effective, while also making it resistant to change. No individual decision or policy change can easily redirect the system, because the system emerges from the interactions of many institutions operating according to their own incentives. The Venezuela operation was possible because decades of institutional development had created capabilities and frameworks that made such operations feasible when political will existed. Understanding this architecture also reveals why such operations, once initiated, are difficult to reverse or moderate. Each institutional actor has invested resources and developed capabilities. Reversing course means fighting against institutional inertia across multiple domains simultaneously. This creates momentum, a tendency for policies to continue and intensify rather than terminate. The hidden architecture of American power is perhaps more important than any individual decision or operation. It is this architecture that enables the United States to project power globally, to respond to challenges quickly, and to coordinate across domains in ways that no other country can match. Venezuela demonstrates this architecture in action, but the same systems operate across dozens of countries and situations simultaneously. Long-term implications and risks. What comes next? No analysis would be complete without examining the long-term implications and risks that this operation creates. While short and medium-term benefits are substantial, the long-term consequences are uncertain and potentially severe. Understanding this uncertainty is crucial for assessing the operation's ultimate wisdom. The most obvious risk is that Venezuela becomes a quagmire. The comparison to Panama is reassuring for American planners, but comparisons to Iraq are more troubling. The United States successfully removed Saddam Hussein in weeks. It spent years trying to stabilize Iraq afterward, at enormous cost in lives, money, and strategic attention. Venezuela is larger than Iraq, with more complex political dynamics and more difficult geography. If Venezuelan resistance proves more substantial than anticipated, if reconstruction proves more expensive than projected, if political stability proves elusive, the operation could become a strategic liability rather than an asset. Trump has stated that the United States will run Venezuela until a transition can be arranged. But what does this mean operationally? How many American personnel will be required? For how long? At what cost? These questions remain unanswered, and history suggests that such commitments tend to be more extensive and prolonged than initial estimates suggest. If the American presence in Venezuela becomes large and indefinite, it ties down military resources that might be needed elsewhere, particularly if tensions with China escalate. The operation also creates precedent that may ultimately work against American interests. If the United States can arrest foreign heads of state on criminal charges and conduct military operations to do so, what prevents other powerful countries from adopting similar approaches? China has been observing carefully. If the United States can act this way in its hemisphere, does that provide justification for Chinese actions in its sphere of influence? Does it make Chinese intervention in Taiwan more likely by establishing that powerful countries can use force against neighboring states when they perceive their interests threatened? Russia has already referenced the Venezuela operation in justifying its own actions in Ukraine. While Russia's invasion of Ukraine preceded the Venezuela operation, Russian officials will certainly use Venezuela as evidence of American hypocrisy when criticizing American support for Ukraine. This precedent weakens American moral authority in criticizing Russian or Chinese uses of force. International law and the norms-based order that the United States helped establish after World War II are significantly weakened by this operation. While powerful countries have always found ways to justify their actions, the brazenness of the Venezuela operation crosses lines that may be difficult to restore. If the international system becomes one in which powerful countries openly disregard sovereignty and use military force to achieve their objectives, the United States may ultimately suffer from this degradation of norms when its relative power declines. The operation may also accelerate de-dollarization rather than preventing it. countries watching the Venezuela operation recognize that proximity to American power brings risk. If holding dollars and integrating with American financial systems makes you vulnerable to American sanctions and potential military action, the rational response is to reduce those vulnerabilities by diversifying away from dollars and developing alternative financial infrastructure. China and Russia will certainly use Venezuela as evidence when encouraging other countries to join non-dollar payment systems. Latin American political dynamics may shift in unpredictable ways. While some governments supported the operation, others condemned it strongly. The operation may energize anti-American movements across the region, creating political challenges for American allies and complicating American relations with major countries like Brazil and Mexico. If the operation is perceived as American imperialism, it may produce a backlash that makes future American influence more difficult to exercise through softer means. The operation also creates moral hazard within American policy making. If forceful action in Venezuela is perceived as successful, it may encourage similar approaches elsewhere. The temptation to use military force to solve problems increases when such force appears to work. This creates risk of overextension, of applying military solutions to problems that require diplomatic or economic approaches, of becoming entrapped in multiple commitments that collectively exceed American capabilities. Humanitarian consequences within Venezuela itself are another concern. The operation caused civilian casualties. Infrastructure damage has occurred. If Venezuela descends into prolonged instability or civil conflict, the humanitarian costs could be substantial. While the Trump administration has promised to improve Venezuelan lives through reconstruction and economic recovery, such promises are easier to make than to fulfill. If ordinary Venezuelans end up worse off than before the operation, moral responsibility falls partly on the United States. There is also the question of what happens to Maduro himself. He sits in a Manhattan jail cell awaiting trial. But his prosecution opens complicated questions. If convicted and imprisoned, does he become a martyr for anti-American movements? If somehow acquitted or released on technicalities, does that weaken the operation's justification? The legal process itself may create ongoing controversies that undermine rather than support American strategic objectives. Finally, there is the fundamental strategic question of whether this operation represents wise allocation of attention and resources. The United States faces a rising China as its primary long-term strategic challenge. American military and intelligence resources are finite. Every commitment in one region is a commitment that cannot be made in another. If managing Venezuela requires substantial ongoing American involvement, does that distract from the pivot to Asia that American strategists have been discussing for years? These long-term risks and implications do not invalidate the short and medium-term benefits we discussed earlier. They represent different time horizons and different types of considerations. The crucial point is that states often prioritize short and medium-term benefits, even when long-term risks are substantial. This is not irrational. Political leaders operate within electoral cycles. Bureaucracies respond to immediate pressures. The future is uncertain, and long-term risks can be rationalized or discounted. Whether the Venezuela operation proves wise in hindsight will depend on factors that are still unfolding. But understanding the operation requires recognizing that the decision to act reflected a calculation that immediate and medium-term benefits outweighed uncertain long-term risks. This is how power operates. This is how states behave. Whether we approve or disapprove, whether we judge the operation as moral or immoral, legal or illegal, wise or foolish, the structural logic behind it reflects enduring patterns in how hegemonic powers respond when they perceive threats to their position. Conclusion: how power behaves when challenged. What does the Venezuela operation ultimately reveal? It reveals that hegemonic power, when threatened, responds through the full spectrum of capabilities at its disposal. Economic pressure through sanctions, diplomatic isolation, intelligence operation, and ultimately, when these prove insufficient, military force. The specific target. Venezuela is less important than the pattern, the logic, the architecture of power projection that makes such operations possible. The operation also reveals something about the current international moment. We live in a period of transition where the unipolar order that emerged after the Cold War is being challenged but not yet replaced. the United States remains overwhelmingly powerful militarily. It still dominates the global financial system. But its position is no longer unquestioned. China has emerged as a peer competitor in economic terms. Russia has demonstrated willingness to challenge American preferences. Other countries increasingly see opportunities to pursue policies independent of American wishes. In this context, the Venezuela operation can be understood as reassertion of American prerogatives. It is a demonstration that despite talk of multipolarity, despite the rise of China, despite challenges to dollar dominance, the United States still possesses both the capability and the will to use force to protect its interests. This reassertion may succeed in slowing or reversing trends toward multipolarity. Or it may accelerate those trends by demonstrating to other countries the risks of remaining within American-dominated system. History has not yet rendered its verdict. The moral dimension of the operation cannot be ignored, though we have largely set it aside for this structural analysis. International law appears to have been violated. Sovereignty has been breached. Civilians have died. A head of state has been forcibly removed and imprisoned without due process by the standards of his own country. These are not trivial matters. They touch on fundamental questions about what kind of international order we want to live in. What constraints should exist on the use of force? What respect should be given to the principle of sovereignty? Yet the harsh reality is that international law has always been selectively enforced. Powerful countries follow international law when it serves their interests and ignore it when it does not. This is not new with Venezuela. It is a pattern repeated throughout history. The United Nations has never been able to constrain the actions of major powers when those powers are determined to act. The international system is not truly law-governed, but rather reflects the distribution of power among its members. The Venezuela operation also illuminates the gap between how power operates and how it is discussed publicly. Official justifications emphasize democracy, human rights, and counter-narcotics. These justifications are not entirely false, but they are incomplete. The deeper motivations involve oil, dollar dominance, competition with China, and maintenance of regional hegemony. Understanding the operation requires looking past the official rhetoric to the structural incentives that actually drive policy. This is how power behaves when systems are challenged. This is what reassertion of dominance looks like in practice. It is not subtle. It is not gradual. It is overwhelming force applied at a moment calculated to achieve maximum effect while minimizing resistance. Whether we find this reassuring or disturbing depends largely on our position relative to American power and our values regarding how international relations should be conducted. For American allies and partners, the operation may be reassuring. It demonstrates that American security guarantees are backed by genuine capability and willingness to act. It shows that America can still project power decisively when necessary. For American rivals and adversaries, the operation is a warning. It reveals the limits of sovereignty when a superpower perceives vital interests at stake. For smaller countries navigating between great powers, the operation is a reminder of the risks of weakness. Venezuela possessed substantial oil reserves but lacked the military capability or the alliance structure to defend itself against American action. The operation reinforces the importance of either aligning with a protective power or developing deterrent capabilities sufficient to make intervention too costly. The long-term trajectory of American power remains uncertain. The Venezuela operation may represent successful adaptation to new challenges, a demonstration that American power remains formidable and can be effectively deployed. Or it may represent overreach, an action whose costs and complications eventually outweigh its benefits. Only time will reveal which interpretation is correct. What is certain is that the operation reflects enduring patterns in how hegemonic powers behave. When dominance is challenged, power responds. When vital interests are threatened, force becomes an option. When rivals attempt to establish positions in your sphere of influence, you act to prevent or reverse those positions. These patterns predate America and will outlast it. They reflect not the peculiarities of American culture or politics, but the structural logic of how power operates in an anarchic international system. Understanding the Venezuela operation through this lens, seeing it as an expression of structural incentives rather than as an isolated decision by particular individuals, provides clarity about what happened and why. It does not necessarily provide comfort. Understanding why power acts as it does is not the same as approving of those actions. But understanding is the foundation for making informed judgments about what the operation means and what consequences it may produce. We live in a world where power still matters enormously, where military capability still shapes outcomes, where sovereignty is respected when backed by strength and violated when that strength is absent. The Venezuela operation has reminded us of these uncomfortable truths. What we do with that reminder, how we respond to these realities, remains to be determined. But ignoring them, pretending that power operates according to principles it routinely violates, serves no one's interests. This has been an examination of strategic logic, structural incentives, and the brutal mathematics of power. It has not been comfortable. It has not provided clear moral guidance or simple answers. But it has, I hope, illuminated why this operation occurred, what it reveals about contemporary American strategy, and what patterns it reflects in how hegemonic powers behave when challenged. The story continues to unfold. Venezuela's future remains uncertain. American involvement may prove brief or prolonged. The strategic benefits may materialize as hoped or prove elusive. But the operation itself and what it reveals about power and its exercise will remain significant regardless of how these uncertainties resolve. Thank you for staying with this analysis, for engaging with uncomfortable questions, for seeking understanding beneath the rhetoric. This is what we do here at Silent Economy. We examine power as it operates, not as we wish it operated. We analyze incentives and structures rather than repeating official narratives. If you value this approach, I ask again that you subscribe, that you share this analysis with others who might find it valuable, and that you continue the discussion in the comments. The exercise of power shapes our world more than most people realize. Understanding that power, seeing its logic clearly, is the first step toward navigating the world as it is rather than as we imagine it to be. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this journey, consider subscribing to Silent Economy.